During American slavery, there were strict rules to keep races separate. Black people were treated as property and faced cruel and inhumane treatment. White women, part of the ruling class, had social power and status, although they were also restricted by the norms of the time. In this setting, any sexual relationship between a white woman and a black male slave had a significant power imbalance. Black men could not easily refuse advances from white women. If these relationships were discovered, the consequences were often severe, especially for the black men involved. The relationships between white women and black male slaves were complicated and full of ethical problems. These interactions were often exploitative, with white women using their social power to force or seduce black men. Because of the power imbalance, these relationships could not be truly consensual. The threat of punishment or retaliation was always there for the enslaved men. White women used different methods to seduce or coerce black male slaves. These methods ranged from subtle manipulation to open force, and the consequences for the enslaved men were always severe if the relationships were discovered. White women often took advantage of the isolation and vulnerability of black male slaves. Enslaved men were usually separated from their families and communities, making them more vulnerable to manipulation. White women would exploit this isolation, offering kindness or special favors to gain the trust and compliance of the enslaved men. The power dynamic between white women and black male slaves meant that any relationship was marked by coercion. White women had the power to grant or withhold favors, punishments, or even basic necessities. They could use this power to manipulate black men into sexual relationships, promising protection or better treatment in return for compliance. In many cases, these relationships were not just coercive but also involved outright sexual violence and rape. Enslaved men had no legal or social way to refuse the advances of white women, and any resistance could lead to brutal punishment or even death. White women could use their social status to force black men into sexual relationships, knowing that the men had no power to refuse or retaliate. The consequences for black male slaves involved in sexual relationships with white women were severe and often fatal. If discovered, these men faced brutal punishments, including whipping, branding, mutilation, or lynching. Even the mere suspicion of a sexual relationship between a black man and a white woman could incite violent reprisals from white men wanting to enforce racial purity and social order. Sexual relationships between white women and black men were heavily taboo and condemned by the broader white society. These relationships were seen as a threat to the racial and social hierarchy. The discovery of such interactions could lead to scandal and ostracism for the white women involved. However, the repercussions were disproportionately harsher for the black men, who bore the brunt of the violence and punishment. There isn't much historical documentation of these relationships because they were secret and surrounded by stigma. Many accounts come from court records, diaries, and letters, giving us rare glimpses into the lives of those involved. The secrecy and silence surrounding these interactions had contributed to their relative obscurity in historical narratives. For some black male slaves, engaging in sexual relationships with white women was a survival strategy. By complying with the advances of white women, they could potentially secure better treatment or protection from harsher forms of punishment. However, this compliance came at a significant personal cost, both physically and psychologically. The legacy of these exploitative relationships is a painful reminder of the brutal realities of slavery and the pervasive power imbalances that characterized it. These interactions highlight the complex and often tragic human experiences within the institution of slavery, revealing the depths of exploitation and dehumanization faced by enslaved individuals.